Welcome to the Smart Keyword Musings, which is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. This week's musings is titled Beyond Bugs, Debt, Culture and Clarity. And this musings I look beyond bugs into the idea of quality debt, then cultural bugs, where we view from a sociotechnical lens, and finally concluding that testing is about seeking clarity. We'll discuss this in three parts, and the first part we'll talk about the hidden weight of quality debt. Now, what is quality debt? We often chase bugs in the code, but we rarely pause to notice what is breaking outside it. Because not all quality problems are technical. Some of them are really about how we work, how we design, and how we drift apart without kind of realizing it. So they are not bugs in the typical notion of bugs in the code. And therefore, debt isn't just about what we didn't build well, but it is really about how we never really understood each other. And therefore, when we look at what is quality debt, it is really the cost we quietly collect when the idea of clarity gives way to shortcuts, and therefore our understanding slips through the cracks. Gaps get created, resulting in the quality debt. And it does not show up in logs because it's not technical in nature, but you feel it in the delays, in the rework, in the growing sense of friction. And therefore, when you compare quality debt versus technical debt, quality debt is really about the reasoning problems, the incoherence in the reasoning, the assumptions that are baked into delivery, which really reflects as fragmented thinking, not just bad code. Whereas technical debt, by definition, is technical. It is in inefficient implementation. Now let's ask the question, how does quality debt creep in? Now we've got multiple functions, as we know. There are product management functions, there are business functions, there is development, and there is QA. So when the intent is not so clear, when all these four parties probably are not exactly synchronized, and the intent is clear, the fixes get rushed, and therefore the patches multiply, and the teams essentially stop speaking the same language. That means the clarity among those teams and the coherence within those teams get disturbed. And therefore, when the teams stop sharing that intent clearly, these small misunderstandings grow roots. And what does it look like? An endless test duplication in vague reports, in meetings, where we go through the same thing again and again and again. The product might just function, but somehow the intent, it feels fuzzy, and there is not much of flow. It seems very brittle. And therefore, when understanding slips, when all of us don't share the common intent, we end up testing more. We end up trusting less. And we spend our time clarifying what we know truly didn't align on. And that results in this higher order quality debt. Now, who pays the price? Testing often becomes, and it is probably the last line of defense, and not just for clarity, and not just for defects, but for broken clarity. Because we are not just validating the behavior of the system, we are really kind of validating the assumptions that no one aligned on. And therefore, testing becomes the last line of defense. And we do it quietly, test by test. And therefore, QA ends up holding the pieces when no one owns the alignment. So quality debt is something more overarching than the typical technical debt, most often caused by the lack of coherence and intent across various teams and assumptions get amplified over time. Let's look at part 2, when culture is really the bug. We know bugs in software, but what's a cultural bug? A cultural bug is more a flaw in the team behavior, not in the logic of the code. And therefore, cultural bugs don't show up or throw out exceptions. They show up in the silence, that somebody is not talking about it, in the rework that we do, in the things that we never really question. So you see, we are examining this from a socio-technical lens. We are shifting the lens to the human side, not the technical side. And therefore, they are not just behaviors, they are signals of deeper patterns left unchecked. And therefore, understand that some bugs live in the habits, not in the code. So what are some of the common cultural bugs? When people stay silent rather than giving feedback. When we resort to heroism rather than systemic process and practice. When there exists gaps of who owns what. And finally, when we are trying to focus only on speed, and that kind of usurps the notion of clarity, then you know there is the cultural bugs are in vogue. Because you may have seen this, but these are not in the logs, but in the behaviors of people. And so when speed becomes the story, clarity becomes the casualty. Because code is never logic. It really reflects the decisions that we make, our pressures we put in, and therefore the trade-offs that happen. And therefore it's important to look at it from not the typical lens of people, process and technology, but at the social-technical lens which views it from the cultural aspect. Because each system carries the shape of its team. And when in that culture, when values and incentives and communications misalign, this fracture is reflected in the software as issues. And remember, not all the bugs are syntactic. Some of them are organizational. And what does it look? It looks like rework might be the cost of what we couldn't say loud. That is, we did not probably talk about it vociferously. We did not probably question about it or argue about it deeply enough. And what are the symptoms of the cultural debt? Lots of redundant tests, over-reliance on being safe, being in the safe hands. The ability, the paralysis of not being able to make the decisions, however hard it may be or easy it may be. And finally, of course, the resistance to questioning, where we accept that you will feel in the bugs that are repeated, in the reviews that are shallow, in the ownership that is vague. And therefore, it's not the failure. It's really the fragility born from conversations that really never happened, the quietness. And I hope you remember, when speed becomes a story, clarity becomes the casualty. Well, testing really doesn't just reveal flaws. It reflects the patterns we have repeated, and the bugs we find tell us kind of who we are. So it's not just about examining the bugs and fixing the technical aspects in the code, but I think it's something more deeper, right? And that's what we need to ultimately fix if we want to really get into the highest performance. QA really acts as a cultural mirror. We just see it typically as reporting issues. But what it reflects really is how teams communicate, how teams prioritize, how teams learn. And therefore, if we keep finding the same problems, maybe the product isn't broken. Maybe the thinking is. Now let's look at the last part. How the fragmentation causes the flow to break. Now some signals don't just throw errors. They show up as confusion, as repetition, and sometimes silence. What does this mean? Well, in the path to software development, what we are trying to constantly do is to spot the invisible, the misunderstanding of requirements, the clarifications which are repeated again and again. Sometimes that the assumptions that we make are not necessarily the same, it's conflicting. And so what we see is we're trying to walk from the path of blur to the path of clarity. And remember, before anything breaks, something blurs. What does that mean? When the clarity fades, understand they are your early indicators of quality debt. Because the truth of the matter is, we want to be in a flow, not to want to be in a fragment. Not want to be seeing everything clearly, not wanting it to be a blur. And therefore, the real fix probably isn't in the code. It is really pausing long enough to understand each other. Because after all, testing is about seeking clarity. Remember, coherence is not a luxury. It is the foundation of speed. We don't always need to do more testing. We actually need to be better aligned. And truly, less rework comes from better listening. So what do we have to do? We have to align the vocabulary. We have to sharpen the responsibilities. We have to build the feedback loops. And therefore, a gentle question is sometimes enough to shift everything. And therefore, understand questioning is important. And it doesn't matter who you are. You don't need a title to improve the clarity. You just need the presence, the curiosity, the courage to notice what others miss. So as a QA person, what we're doing is to constantly question, irrespective of to whom. So therefore, use questions and not commands. Be a facilitator or not fight, and cross the boundaries whenever you need to. Because it's all about exerting a quiet influence without authority. And why are we doing this? To seek clarity. So what if testing wasn't about what works, but whether we are working together? What do we mean by that? It means we have a newer role for QA, from being a defender to designers of understanding. Remember, QA is evolving. It's not just about pass and fail. It's about coherence. Do we test systems? Yes. But remember, we also test shared understanding. And therefore, maybe every test is asking the same thing. Did we really mean the same thing when we said done? And therefore, we are trying to build in the notion of constantly seeking clarity, building coherence. And therefore, the question that begs to be asked is, what are you really testing? In the end, quality is a mirror of shared meaning. The best tests don't just catch failures. They really expose what we really never agreed in the first place. So the idea is to be in a flow, not to be fragmented. And as we close down, ask this final question. What are you really testing? The code or the coherence? I hope you found this Smart QA musings interesting. Thank you.